Imagine having to abandon your family, your comforts, your way of life, for the slightest chance of hope and opportunity of advancement. Imagine having to walk miles and miles only to wait impatiently for an indefinite amount of time. This was the life of braceros, who from early adolescence were compelled to work tirelessly in inhumane conditions, far from home in an attempt to provide a sustained life for themselves and their loved ones. The culprits? The Mexican and American governments, for they made it their effort to exploit such laborers and make them contribute to the welfare of their nation's economy rather than the laborers' personal interest. Here, at this junction, from the crucible of American capital investment and Latin American labor, are wrought the triumphs and tragedies that shaped the lives of Mexican laborers, and the triumphs and tragedies that formed the imperialized relationship between Mexico and the United States. In December of 1941, when the United States entered World War II after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, manpower was decreasing as more and more males were drafted into the war. The men and women left were all put to work in factories and companies supplying the war, and those in rural areas were moving to the city to attend to the higher wages that the defense economy provided. This program allowed for the agricultural processes to continue as citizens continued fighting for the United States. On June 1st of 1942, Mexico declared war on the Axis powers, and immediately after, the U.S. Department of State was asked to approach Mexico officially on the question of the importation of foreign labor. In providing the necessary laborers to the United States, Mexico believed they could contribute to the Allied war effort and could benefit economically as a country. Over the course that the Bracero program was implemented into the lives of unskilled Mexican laborers in the American agricultural sector, the United States and Mexican governments successfully transformed their social, political, and economic structure into an international exchange of cheap labor for national progression. When Franklin D. Roosevelt gave his State of the Union speech in 1942, the institution of the Bracero program decreed that it would be the cooperation of the United States and Mexico in such time of war. Roosevelt held his admiration for Manuel Ávila Camacho, the Mexican president of the time, and together they began restoring the relationship destroyed by the Mexican-American War. Camacho agreed to such action and hoped that his vision of national progress would succeed through the contracted men's ability to acquire the skills and wages necessary for Mexico's social and technological advancement. With the signing of Public Law 78 in 1951, U.S. officials would import Mexican men to build and repair railroads and harvest crops throughout the United States for 3 to 6 month contract periods. They were able to exploit over, and soon after, were able to lay them off once their contract ended.
They work mostly for big farmers who call themselves growers, although they personally grow and harvest only profits.
In the end, the only thing the 30 cents an hour Bracero paychecks supplied were the economies of both governments, for they would receive 10% of each pay stub. The agreement between the Mexican and U.S. governments guaranteed certain benefits and protections for Mexican workers, including free sanitary housing, medical treatment, bathing facilities, transportation, wages equal to those of American farm workers, and a contract written in Spanish. However, this was not the case. Although working on U.S. soil was made out to be a better alternative than facing the harsh standard of living from their native land, Mexican laborers were abused, and almost every agreement was shattered, along with their hopes for a better life for their families. Approximately 4.6 million agricultural workers migrated to the United States, expecting a good salary in exchange for maintaining the crops. Some left their families, were forced to wait hours, days, even weeks in overcrowded recruitment points located along border towns before having rid of their status by American border officials, and on top of that, treated like contrabands that carried parasites. Braceros worked 14 to 18-hour shifts, deprived from food, and water until farm owners were pleased with the amount of crops collected throughout the day. Mexican laborers who worked arduous hours in the fields in hopes of a better life were denied basic human necessities, were forced to pay for promised free shelter and food. Thousands of braceros were brought in to perform stoop labor, a task that causes back injuries resulting from the constant strain of bending over all day. The official Bracero Agreement, released on April 26 of 1943, also established that Mexican laborers should not suffer any acts of discrimination. Nevertheless, workers were discriminated against to such an extent that the Mexican government forbade the use of its nationals in the fields in Texas. In addition, many public establishments, such as restaurants and movie theaters, had signs prohibiting service to any Mexicans, resulting in a segregated community. By the end of the Bracero Agreement, many Mexican workers never received compensation and were therefore unable to live a stable life back home, so they unfortunately continued to cross the border to work farms and ranches in the U.S. The Bracero program failed the Braceros. Government abandonment allowed for an exploitive environment to be created, which was seized by oppressive and money-hungry employers. After 52 years, the destructive failures of the Bracero program were reevaluated, and the H-2A program was signed into action in 2016. The promises of El Norte are once again available for struggling workers, along with the rebuilt faith in the government who has enforced serious regulations to ensure worker protection for both non-immigrants and U.S. workers. These government-enforced mandates hold agriculture owners to higher standards, triumphantly benefiting non-immigrants as well as U.S. workers. The Braceros were stripped of their humanity, stripped of their guaranteed unalienable rights, and abused to the point where striking and boycotting were direct violations to their contracts. In 1964, which marks the death of the Bracero program, a new organization was given life. The National Farm Workers Association was created by Chicano heroes Cesar Chavez and Dolores Huerta, along with contributing Filipino leaders Philip Veracruz and Larry Leong. These agricultural captains, who witnessed the excruciating physical obstacles placed before agricultural workers, learned from the Braceros who lacked organization and a voice, and banded together to form one. Fear of violating contracts, and even fear of death, becomes meaningless when your cries for justice become a triumphant trumpet ringing around the world. But even then, such nations alike still face the struggles and prejudices of transnational immigration. Immigrants continue being dehumanized, oppressed, and shamed for providing agricultural intensification. This inconceivable sacrifice is unrightfully taken for granted, and as citizens of a nation built on the backs of manipulated minorities, ensuring this injustice is never faded into history nor allowed to be repeated is our social responsibility.